Have you ever imagined attending a wake without a body? One family did this, believing it would be merely a symbolic gesture to end their mourning. But what was supposed to bring peace opened a door that never closed. Days later, everyone began to hear the same phrase whispered in the silence of the house. "I'm still here. You forgot to find me." And from that moment on, nothing was the same. Mirrors reflected presences, chairs moved on their own, and even dreams became an interrupted ritual, crying out to be completed. If you like dark, spiritual, and mysterious stories, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and leave a comment saying, "I wouldn't have the courage to stay in that house." Your participation helps this community grow and keeps these stories alive. The small chapel perched high above the city had never welcomed so many people. That night, candles flickered in rows, casting a dim light that seemed more tired than welcoming. In the center, on a pedestal, draped in black cloth, there was no coffin, only an old, slightly dusty black and white photograph showing the face of the missing relative. White flowers, already beginning to wilt, surrounded the frame, as if time were reminding everyone that mourning there was strange, incomplete. The absence of the body transformed the wake into something almost theatrical. People prayed, some wept softly, but there was always that emptiness hovering over everyone. There was no goodbye, no end, just a staging. Of death, the priest recited prayers as if repeating a mechanical protocol, and each word seemed to echo without force, without purpose. The family, gathered in the front pews, tried to maintain their composure. The mother clutched her rosary so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The father, rigid, kept his eyes fixed on the photograph, as if expecting it to move at any moment. The eldest daughter wept silently, while the youngest son didn't fully understand what was happening. But he sensed the strangeness, that feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. The atmosphere was not just one of mourning, but of anticipation. It was as if the absence of the body was not just a physical absence, but an open door. Without mortal remains, there was no certainty, no rest, no closure. The energy of the chapel reflected this. Each candle that extinguished itself seemed to reinforce that the ceremony was not complete. A neighbor commented quietly, "I don't know if it's right to hold a wake without a body. It seems like we're calling for something we don't understand." The words hung in the air, and many avoided looking at him, but deep down, everyone was thinking the same thing. The wake was symbolic, but what was left open carried weight. An invisible weight already insinuating itself that night. When the ceremony ended, the family walked slowly home. There was no relief at the end, no sense of duty fulfilled. There was only a hole in their chest, an unanswered question. The portrait of the missing man seemed to carry a lively gaze, as if disapproving of this impromptu farewell. At that moment, none of them could have foreseen what was to come. But the seed of return had already been planted, because in the spiritual world, what is not ended never disappears, it just waits. And that night, inside the empty chapel, with the candles still burning silently, a cold wind swept down the aisle, and for a moment, someone swore they heard a whisper coming from the photograph on display. "I'm still here." The house seemed larger that night, as if the rooms had been discreetly lengthened just to accommodate the silence. The candles for the symbolic wake had been extinguished and brought in a bag. Some were placed on the living room dresser, others forgotten in the back of a drawer. The black and white photograph, now devoid of flowers, rested on the sideboard, among keys and bills, like a visitor without a place. The eldest daughter, Clara, was slow to fall, asleep. She tossed and turned, feeling restlessness tighten her back muscles. She didn't want to admit it, but the portrait's gaze had followed her all day. It was as if the image carried a small remnant of warmth, not life, but stubbornness. It was past midnight when a light wind blew through the cracks in the window and the curtain moved slowly, like a hand gesture. She closed her eyes, trying to convince herself it was just fatigue. The room, however, seemed different, with a bluish tint in the darkness. like hospital corridors. Clara reached for her cell phone to check the time, and that was when she felt it. A cold breath, close to her ear. It wasn't a breath of wind. It was a presence. "Dad," he whispered, not daring to speak out loud. The hallway responded with the distant creak of wood and nothing more. Her hands were sweating. Her heart, previously racing, fell into a heavy rhythm, as if each beat were pushing something old, forgotten. Clara settled back on the pillow, trying to laugh at herself when the voice came, low, close, intimate. "I'm still here." She sat up in bed, as if pulled by a thread. The sentence hadn't come through the door or from the backyard. It had originated inside the room. The sound seemed neither masculine nor feminine. It was a disembodied, salivaless register, a speech that needed no mouth. Instinct told her to scream, but instead she got up and turned on the lamp. The yellow light revealed only the familiar contours, the wardrobe, the chair with the school shirt, the open backpack. The air, however, remained cold, as it had been before the rain. Clara walked to the door. The dark hallway gave him the faintest reflection from the living room's glass. And there, in the distant mirror, he swore he saw the gleam of a shoulder, an almost human outline standing beside the sideboard where the photograph rested. It wasn't a body, it was insistence. He took 2 steps. The floor creaked, as if waiting. The voice came again, calmer, as if explaining a simple mistake. "You forgot to find me." The ground seemed to give way beneath her feet. "Find?" The word stuck in Clara's throat, rough, like dust from an old drawer. She remembered the priest's expression in the chapel, a duty fulfilled, and her mother's gaze as hard as a knot in a handkerchief. A wake without a body, a farewell without a destination. "Mom?" he called almost childishly. The mother appeared in the bedroom doorway, weary, her hair tied in a crooked bun. She saw her daughter pale, her eyes wide, and understood without Clara saying so. They walked together to the living room. The photograph seemed darker with the touch of shadows. The mother, firm, tried to rationalize, "It's the weight of the day. Tomorrow will pass." But when she turned the painting over to remove it from the sideboard, a streak of broken dust revealed something beneath the base. 2 oval marks, parallel, as if fingers had been resting there, waiting. Her mother froze. Clara, nearby, felt the cold breath return, not a threat, but a demand. The 2 replaced the photograph, almost reverently. The mother made the sign of the cross. Clara, faithless, simply clasped her hands together. For long seconds, no clocks, no street, no dripping pipe in the laundry room could be heard. Only then, from inside the house, as soft as a thought that refuses to die, the whisper repeated, "I'm still here." The rest of the night passed without further words, but no one really slept. And at dawn, the house seemed smaller, not because it had shrunk, but because someone now occupied the space of absence. After the night Clara heard the first whisper, the family tried to keep quiet about what had happened. Her mother asked that no one comment, so as not to give strength to what doesn't exist. Her father, more practical, avoided talking, pretending nothing had happened. But silence doesn't erase what has already been awakened. On the contrary, it only seemed to amplify it. 2 days later, it was my mother who heard it. I was in the backyard, collecting clothes from the clothesline when the wind suddenly died, leaving the room still and suffocating. The leaves froze in the air, as if all of nature had held its breath. And behind her, close to my ear, the same phrase rang out, quiet and painful. "I'm still here. You forgot to find me." She dropped her clothes, her eyes watering with fear. She looked around. Nothing. Just the empty yard, the sun already sinking behind. The trees, but the chill of the whisper still clinging to her skin. She ran into the house, and for the first time, she couldn't hide the trembling in her hands. That same night, it was his father's turn. He got up in the middle of the night to get a drink of water. The kitchen was in darkness, lit only by the pale moonlight streaming through the window. As he filled the glass, he realized he wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and before he could even turn around, a voice echoed from inside the house, as if coming from the walls. "You forgot to find me." The glass slipped from his hands, shattering on the floor. He backed away, breathing quickly, but he couldn't bring himself to look back. He knew if he looked, he could see. And then the children, the youngest, 9, began waking up in the middle of the night crying, saying that his uncle was in the room and that he kept repeating the same phrase. Clara, exhausted from trying to convince him it was just a nightmare, finally confessed that she heard it too. With that confession, the family's fear gained a name. It was no longer an isolated imagination. It was a shared presence. What disturbed them most was the uniformity of the voice. It didn't matter if it was dawn, afternoon, backyard, or kitchen. It didn't matter if they were dreaming or awake. The phrase was always said the same way, low, clear, without anger, without haste, just a sad demand, a constant reminder that the wake hadn't ended. Anything only ignited the weight, and little by little, the house became a stage for this repetition. The old radio turned on by itself, emitting static interspersed with whispers. The wind dragged the living room curtains, and behind the fabric, the phrase echoed. Even the walls began to crack in rhythmic patterns, as if repeating muffled syllables. The phrase became part of their routine. During the day, they pretended not to hear. At night, they covered themselves in hurried prayers. But it was useless. The missing man, who had never had a body to rest, now had a voice, and that voice would not be silenced until it was answered. It was late afternoon when Marta's mother decided to tidy the living room. The flowers used in the symbolic wake, already wilted and dark, still sat in a glass vase on the sideboard. The sweet smell of decay permeated the room, giving the impression that mourning still lingered in the corners of the house. As she gathered fallen petals from the floor, something caught her attention. The antique mirror on the wall seemed shinier than usual, as if its surface had been freshly polished. She walked over, absent-mindedly fixing her hair, and that was when she saw it. Behind her, reflected with disturbing clarity, was a male silhouette standing in the corner of the room. It was a dark, firm outline with no facial details, but with an unmistakable posture. Someone observing, motionless, as if waiting. Marta felt her heart skip a beat. She turned around immediately, but the real space was empty. Just the walls, the sideboard, and the portrait of the missing man in its black frame. She turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, the narrow shoulders, the bent neck, the head slightly lowered, like someone listening in silence. Marta took 2 steps back, her breathing quickening, but the figure didn't disappear. On the contrary, it seemed to take shape, as if the surface reflected something that wasn't allowed to manifest in the physical world. It was at that moment that the figure's lips moved, even though there was no visible mouth. The sound came from inside the room, low, deep, firm. "I'm still here. You forgot to find me." Marta dropped the cleaning cloth from her hands. The smack of the cloth on the floor echoed loudly, but her voice lingered, repeating the words calmly, almost like an inverted prayer. She backed away until she was leaning against the living room door, her eyes fixed on the mirror, trying to convince herself it was her imagination. But her body knew the truth. The chills on the back of her neck, the cold in her fingers, the feeling that she was being watched, were not in her mind. Clara entered the room at that moment and saw her mother standing motionless in front of the mirror. When she asked what was happening, Marta couldn't answer. She simply pointed at the reflection. Clara looked and for a second saw nothing. But when she looked away and looked back at the surface, the figure was there, clear, next to the portrait on the sideboard. Her daughter screamed, and in that instant the figure vanished, as if it had dissolved into the glass. The silence that followed was worse than the sight. They both stood still, breathing rapidly, not daring to touch the mirror. Marta then covered the object with a thick sheet in an instinctive attempt to break the channel that seemed to have opened, but it was too late. The mirror had shown that the missing relative was not only present in voices, he was now seeking form, even if only through reflections. That night, no one passed through the room without glancing twice at the cloth covering the glass. And each time the wind moved the fabric slightly, they were certain the figure was there, behind it, waiting for the right moment to be seen again. The photograph on the sideboard seemed darker, and the dead flowers, now dry, scattered their petals, as if marking invisible steps on the floor. And in their ears, even after. Going to their rooms, mother and daughter swore they heard the same repeated murmur coming from inside the covered mirror. "I'm still here." After the night the mirror revealed the silhouette, the house was never the same. The thick sheet still covered the gilded frame, but everyone knew the cloth didn't erase what had already been seen. On the contrary, it was as if, beneath that fabric, the reflection breathed, waiting for the chance to show itself again. In the days that followed, the presence ceased to be limited to voices and reflections. It began to act upon the physical space, as if trying to impose its existence. It all started with the candles, the ones used in the symbolic wake, some still kept in a glass dish in the living room, began to go out on their own. Sometimes, even protected from the wind, the flame would shrink until it disappeared, leaving behind only a wisp of smoke that rose like thin fingers pointing to the ceiling. On other nights, the opposite happened. Forgotten candles, now without wicks, would relight, casting a weak, unstable flame. Then came the photograph. The black and white portrait, which everyone avoided looking at directly, began to fall repeatedly. No matter how much his father straightened it on the sideboard, in the middle of the night, they heard the dull sound of the glass hitting the floor. The next morning, there was the photo, turned over, the frame cracked, but the image intact, as if something invisible had purposely pushed it, demanding attention. The worst part, however, were the chairs. The first time, Clara woke to the sound of wood scraping across the floor. When she ran to the kitchen, she found one of the table chairs pushed against the wall, its back to everyone. Her father blamed the wind, but the scraping sound echoed too heavily to have been caused by a draft. The next night, it happened again. Two chairs were now facing each other, as if someone had positioned them to talk. And on one of them rested his mother's rosary, which had previously been kept in the bedroom drawer. Every gesture seemed charged with intention. It wasn't destruction, it wasn't violence, it was insistence. As if the presence wanted to dialogue but couldn't use words beyond those already repeated. "I'm still here. You forgot to find me." The youngest son, innocent in his childhood vision, began talking to himself in the hallway. His mother, desperate, asked who he was talking to. The boy answered without hesitation, "With him. He said he's waiting for us." That night, the family decided to lock the doors and windows, as if this could contain what had already crossed the house's boundaries. But the signs persisted. Objects fell from shelves without explanation. Glasses slid off the table and shattered on the floor. The wall clock, which marked the days, began to lose minutes every morning, as if time too were being manipulated by the presence. The father, already on the verge of losing control, tried to shout into the void, "What do you want from us? What is still missing?" The answer came not in voice, but in action. The photograph fell again, this time face down, and one of the candles lit itself, casting a high, unstable flame. In the reflection of the frame's cracked glass, Marta swore she saw for a few seconds two eyes watching, fixed, filled with sadness. The message was given. It wasn't just a memory. It wasn't just a lost spirit. It was a calling, and with each object moved, each candle extinguished, each chair dragged, the message became clearer. The absence of the body was not acceptance. It was a void that demanded to be filled. The weight of the events in the house could no longer be ignored. The mother could barely pray without her rosary disappearing from her hands. The father avoided the darkest rooms, and the children lived between nightmares and suppressed sighs. The symbolic wake, meant to end an absence, had only opened a deeper wound. It was as if the soul of the deceased had rejected this incomplete ceremony. It was then that the father decided to seek answers. There were rumors. Stories whispered for years in the neighboring town about the life his relative had led before disappearing. Little was said openly, but the elders remembered uncomfortable details. He was not just an ordinary man, but someone involved in spiritual practices most preferred to avoid. The father began by visiting the registry office, then the parish archives. He found incomplete records, dates that didn't match, reports that the missing man had traveled repeatedly to isolated places in search of teachings. These were no ordinary trips. They were nocturnal gatherings in remote houses, led by men and women who spoke of passages between worlds, of rituals that kept alive those who weren't ready to leave. One phrase appeared repeatedly in the papers and testimonies of the elders: "He died in transit." No one could quite explain what it meant, but the expression carried a heavy truth. According to local legend, dying in transit meant failing a rite of passage, leaving the soul trapped between the world of the living and the dead. It wasn't rest, but it wasn't life either. It was a forced permanence. The family began to piece together. The bodiless wake had brought no closure because there was no body to be closed. The missing man had found no rest. The absence of the body was not just a tragedy, it was a consequence. And the repeated whisper, "I'm still here. You forgot to find me," now sounded like confirmation. As they investigated, more signs emerged in the house. The walls began to be stained with circles of soot, as if candles had burned themselves against the plaster. The missing man's personal belongings, stored in wooden boxes, gave off a damp, earthy smell, as if they had been recently unearthed. It was Clara, the eldest daughter, who found the clearest clue. Rummaging through the bottom of a forgotten trunk in the attic, she found a leather-bound notebook worn with age. The pages, stained and scribbled, spoke of a ritual of completion. In it, the missing man described how he sought to cross between worlds, but that he needed 3 stages completed. The last, written in shaky handwriting, was interrupted halfway through, and just below the last sentence, almost illegible, a note: "If I fail, I will be trapped, and I will wait to be found." The words sent chills down the spine of the entire family. That night, as they tried to digest their discovery, they heard the whisper again, louder, echoing in every room at once, as if the air itself was speaking. "They haven't found me yet." The whole house shook, the candles lit by themselves, and for the first time, the portrait fell forward, revealing a crack that ran across the face of the missing man. It was no longer just absence, it was demand. The children were the most vulnerable, while the adults tried to rationalize, searching for documents and evidence. The youngest son, Gabriel, lived between innocence and fear. His mind still couldn't separate imagination from reality, and it was precisely in this space that the presence seemed to grow stronger. During the first few nights, Gabriel spoke only of strange dreams. He said he dreamed of a man sitting in the corner of the room, head bowed, as if waiting to be called. At first, his mother tried to comfort him, saying it was just a reflection of everything they were going through. But over time, the repetition of the descriptions became frightening. The boy always described the same scene: dark clothes, hands resting on his knees, and slow, pain-laden breathing. "He doesn't talk to me, he just stares," the boy said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the ground. But on the 4th night, something changed. Gabriel woke screaming. He said that this time the man had raised his head and shown his face, or what was left of it, deep-set eyes like empty caverns, and a mouth that moved without making a sound. The boy swore he could read his lips. "I'm still here." The family began taking turns sleeping in the room with him, but the feeling of his presence became increasingly oppressive. Even the adults lying on the mattress next to the bed felt his cold breath on their necks in the wee hours of the morning. On the 7th night, the impossible happened. Gabriel woke again, but this time there were no screams. The silence in the house was so absolute it seemed deafening. When his mother opened her eyes, she saw her son sitting motionless on the bed, staring into the dark corner of the room. She followed the boy's gaze, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. There stood the shadow, tall, slender, perfectly outlined against the gloom. It wasn't a reflection, it wasn't a dream, it was real. The mother tried to stand, but her muscles tightened as if something were invisibly holding her down. The air grew heavy, making it difficult to breathe. The shadow slowly raised its head, revealing deep-set eyes that reflected no light. The mouth moved, and this time the sound came out, low and drawn out, filling the entire room. "You forgot to find me." Gabriel shrank back, hiding his face in his knees, and in that childish gesture, something happened. The candle forgotten on the dresser lit itself, casting a flickering light. The shadow retreated slightly as if the flame bothered it, but it did not disappear. The father rushed in, drawn by the glow, and the instant the door opened, the shadow dissipated, evaporating into the air like thick smoke. The candle went out on its own shortly thereafter, leaving only the smell of burning wax and a heavy silence. The room looked the same, but the family knew. It was no longer just a whisper or a reflection. Now the presence had a body. Now the missing person had found a way to get through. And Gabriel, in tears, said the phrase that no adult wanted to repeat. He said that if we don't finish what's left, we'll have to stay here forever. The notebook found in the attic with the ritual interrupted took on even more weight. The family realized that the shadow wasn't just seeking remembrance or recognition, it was seeking closure. But at what price? After the night the shadow took shape in Gabriel's room, sleep ceased to be a refuge. What had previously seemed like an isolated disturbance in the boy now spread to everyone, like an invisible contamination. Little by little, each family member began to dream the same thing. A ritual interrupted, always at the same point, always with the same feeling of suffocating emptiness. Clara was the first. She fell asleep after hours of vigil when her body finally gave out no more. In the dream, she found herself in a circular room, lit by dozens of candles floating in the air, none of them giving off heat. In the center, a man in dark clothes murmured words she couldn't understand. Just as she was about to utter the last sentence, the candlelight suddenly went out, plunging everything into darkness, and then, in the darkness, a whisper arose, not in her ears, but inside her head. "One candle is missing. I'm still here." The next morning, Clara woke in a cold sweat, unable to tell her everything. But as she described the circle of candles, she realized her mother had had the same vision. Marta, pale, confirmed it. She had also been in a space of ancient stones, felt the same cold breath, heard the same phrase. The father, initially skeptical, denied it. But the next night, when he woke abruptly, his hands were burned with faint red marks, as if he had been holding lit candles. He tried to hide it, but he couldn't hide the truth. He had also had the same dream, heard the same voice, and woke with the certainty that it wasn't just his imagination. From that point on, dreams became collective. It was as if everyone shared the same dream space, reliving the same scene over and over, night after night. No matter what time they fell asleep, the result was identical, a ritual that was never completed. Something was always missing, always the feeling of emptiness. Most disturbing was the realization that Gabriel, the youngest, not only dreamed but also repeated phrases from the ritual aloud in his sleep. He murmured in a language no one knew, guttural, drawn-out sounds that echoed like ancient chants. One night, his mother woke up beside him and heard clearly, "You forgot to find me. Finish what I started." It was as if the presence used the boy's body as a channel. Days became unbearable. Sleep became a condemnation. Each dawn, the family returned to the same circle of candles, the same interrupted emptiness, the same echo of the phrase that wouldn't leave them alone. The deep circles under their eyes betrayed their exhaustion. The walls of the house began to crack, not physically, but perceptually. Every shadow seemed to deepen. Every dark corner seemed to hide a pair of eyes. The interrupted ritual mentioned in the attic notebook, was now confirmed in the dreams. The 3 steps described were almost complete, but the last one had been cut. And this failure seemed to condemn not only the missing person, but all who carried his blood and his memory. The mother finally gave in to what she feared most, seeking spiritual help. She went to a guide known for dealing with cases of souls in transit. The woman listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the ground. When Marta finished recounting her dreams, the guide simply murmured, "He's not dead, not yet. He's stuck between one side and the other, and he uses you as a bridge until the last candle is lit." The words brought relief and terror at the same time. There was a way out, but the price was yet to come. That night, everyone dreamed again. Only this time, instead of just watching, they felt the shadow approach the circle, raising its head. And for the first time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, firm and desperate. "Finish the ritual, or you will stay here with me." The notebook, found in the attic, with its stained pages and broken words, became the only possible guide. Marta, with trembling hands, read aloud what remained of the instructions, though many lines were illegible. The notes spoke of 3 stages: preparation, evocation, and sealing. The last, the sealing, was only half finished. The cut-out sentence seemed to demand something simple, yet crucial. "Light the last candle." The spirit guide had confirmed the floor was there. The absence of the final candle kept the spirit in transit, disembodied and restless, condemned to echo between worlds. And now, with the family being used as a bridge, the ritual needed to be completed. That night, they decided to gather in the living room where it all had begun. The black and white portrait was placed back on the sideboard, surrounded by the old candles left over from the symbolic wake. The air felt heavy, as if the whole house were holding its breath. The children were present, despite their fear. Gabriel, in particular, seemed entranced, his eyes fixed on the portrait, as if waiting for instructions only he could hear. Her father lit the candles one by one. With each flame, the temperature in the room dropped further. The wind blew against the closed windows, as if something wanted to get in or out. Clara read the fragments from the notebook aloud, filling in the gaps with intuition and fear. The words sounded ancient, heavy, but they resonated powerfully. It was then that the floor shook slightly. The chairs in the living room shifted on their own, forming a perfect circle around the family. The photograph fell once more, but instead of turning front or back, it slid to the center of the circle. There still, it seemed to vibrate with its own light. The whisper came from all directions at once, so intense it seemed to push the air against the skin. "I'm still here. Light the last candle." The father searched. Frantically, they had only 9 candles lit. The 10th, the most important, was gone. Panic took hold, but Gabriel, in a trance, slowly got up and walked to the dark corner of the room. He bent down, and as if he knew exactly where to look, pulled out a small candle forgotten behind the sideboard, covered in dust and hardened wax. "That's it," said the boy, but his voice seemed to echo alongside another, deeper one. The father hesitated. The flame trembled in his hands, almost extinguished. Before it could be born. The mother wept, begging him to hurry. Clara prayed, though she no longer believed in prayers. When the flame finally touched the wick of the last candle, a bright light spread through the room. The other candles burned brighter, as if they all shared the same breath. The shadow appeared tall and clear in the center of the circle. But this time it wasn't sitting, it wasn't still. It stood erect, its eyes melting into darkness, its mouth open in a silent scream. For a moment it seemed about to swallow everyone there. The father almost blew out the candle in fear, but Gabriel held his hand tightly. The shadow then took a step back. The scream turned into something softer, a sigh, and for the first time, the sentence changed. "Now I can rest." The candles flickered one by one until they went out on their own. The photograph on the floor split in two, as if marking the end of a decades-long wait. The room was plunged into absolute silence. No wind, No crackling, no whisper, only the weight of the family's breathing finally free. But the relief brought with it an unbearable doubt. If the ritual had been completed, why did the house still feel so charged? And why, even in silence, did they still feel as if someone was watching from the other side of the covered mirror? The room fell silent after the last candle burned out. The scent of burning wax and dried flowers filled the air, bringing a false sense of closure. The family looked at each other in shock, unsure whether to give thanks, cry, or simply remain silent. Marta was the first to break the silence, murmuring between sobs, "He rested. It's over." But the sentence didn't sound like certainty. It was more of a request, an attempt to convince herself. The father, still trembling, picked up the shards of the broken photograph. The glass was cold, damp, as if it had just been dug out of the ground. On the back of the picture, however, was something no one expected: handmade. Marks, scratches that formed crooked but legible words. A short phrase repeated 3 times: "The candle must never go out." Everyone's stomach churned. Clara felt the weight of the sentence like a stone on her chest. Gabriel, still in a trance, repeated softly, as if it were an automatic echo, "You must never erase. You must never erase." That's when they realized. Though the spirit had dissipated before their eyes, the energy of the house hadn't changed. The invisible weight lingered in the dark corners. The cold lingered. And most disturbingly, the sheet-covered mirror in the corner of the room seemed to pulse slightly, as if someone on the other side was pressing against the glass, waiting. That night, no one slept. The attic notebook was reread several times. They discovered notes they hadn't noticed before, scribbles in the margins nearly erased by time. The ritual seals, but does not expel. The flame is a bridge. As long as it burns, there will be rest. But if it goes out, the traffic begins again. Terror gripped them. They had completed the ritual but not ended their presence. They had merely made a silent pact to keep the candle lit forever. The next morning, Marta placed a new candle on the sideboard and kept it lit. Around her, the atmosphere seemed lighter, more bearable. The children played again, and their father was able to breathe without feeling the constant oppression. For a moment, life seemed normal, but all it took was for the flame to flicker in the middle of the afternoon, for everyone to rush to the living room in panic. They didn't hear the voice, but they felt it. A collective shiver, a cold breath, as if the shadow were just waiting. Days passed, and the family's routine became one of vigilance. Shifts were taken to ensure the candle never went out. Prayers murmured, even by those who never believed. Home was no longer a home, but a permanent altar. And each night, as the candle burned, the dreams came. No longer the incomplete circle, but the presence watching from afar, silent as if awaiting a new opportunity. Clara, one of those early mornings, woke up to find her brother fast asleep. On his chest, a hand-shaped stain of soot remained, like a reminder. She tried to wipe it away, but the mark wouldn't come off. That same night, before going to sleep, they all heard together, coming from the covered mirror, "I'm still here." The candle flickered, almost going out, but it held, and the family understood the cruel truth. The cycle was not over. The spirit's rest depended on the flame, and as long as there was fire, there would be silence. But the moment the candle went out completely, the visitor would return. The symbolic wake had become an eternal vigil, and the promise was not of liberation, it was of continuity, because in the world of the dead, nothing is lost. It just waits.